Chapter 1, Apollo 11, an overview of the official version. Lights, camera, action! Between 1968 and 1972, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration NASA launched 11-manned missions on the Saturn V and Saturn V rocket to low Earth orbit. 9 of these manned missions went beyond low Earth orbit using the Saturn V rocket, and 6 landed on the lunar surface, Apollo 11 being the first mission to do so. The Saturn V was a 3-stage rocket that stood 363 feet tall on the launch pad. Each stage of the rocket had a specific function. The first stage was filled with kerosene and liquid oxygen and had 7,653,845 pounds of thrust and was used to launch the Saturn V rocket to an altitude of 36.7 miles. The second stage was filled with liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen and had 1,120,216 to 1,157,707 pounds of thrust. After the separation of the first stage, the second stage was used to boost the Apollo spacecraft to an altitude of 101.4 miles. The third stage was filled with liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen and had 178,161 to 203,779 pounds of thrust. After the separation of the second stage, the third stage was used to insert the Apollo spacecraft into a circular Earth parking orbit. The Lunar Module LM was stored in the Spacecraft Lunar Module Adapter SLA located on the top of the third stage, the SIVB. Above the SIVB was the Command and Service Module CSM. The Launch Escape System LES was fixed to a Boost Protective Cover BPC. The BPC covered the Command Module CM to protect it from heat friction with air during the first 3 minutes of the launch and from the solid fuel rocket motors of the LES. In case of an emergency, the LES was used to pull the CM away from the Saturn V to safety for an emergency splashdown. A more in-depth look at the testing and performance aspects of the Saturn V will be discussed in Chapter 2. The Apollo 11 astronauts. Apollo 11 was NASA's 5th manned mission in the Apollo program and the 3rd manned mission which left LEO on its mission to the Moon. It was also the first mission to land a crew on the lunar surface. The crew included Commander Neil Armstrong, Command Pilot Michael Collins, and Lunar Module Pilot Edward Buzz E. Aldrin. For each of the Apollo missions, there was always a backup crew. For Apollo 11, the backup crew consisted of Commander James A. Lovell, Command Module Pilot Williams A. Anders, and Lunar Module Pilot Fred W. Hayes. Neil Armstrong started flying at the age of 14, paying about $10 for each lesson, which lasted about 1.5 hours. This today amounts to approximately $10 or more for every 5 minutes. He got his pilot's license at 16. In 1947, he was accepted for a naval scholarship and went to Purdue University in Indiana. After 18 months, the Navy sent him to Pensacola in Florida for flight training. In 1950, he flew combat missions in the Korean War. After the Korean War, he continued on for further flight training. In 1952, he resigned from the Navy and enrolled again at Purdue University. In 1960, Armstrong flew the X-15, which could reach altitudes of over 200,000 feet, which he described as akin to being in a spaceship in orbit. After applying to NASA in 1962, in which the organization was now accepting civilian applicants, he was accepted for astronaut training. Edward Eugene Aldrin Jr., aka Buzz Aldrin, his eldest sister when young used to pronounce brother as Buzzer, hence the name, went to the military academy at West Point, New York. After graduating in 1951, Aldrin joined the Air Force and trained as a fighter pilot. He also flew combat missions in North Korea. His gun camera film supposedly showed a pilot ejecting from a MiG he shot down, which was featured in Life magazine. In 1954, after spending 4 months in Maxwell Field, Alabama in Squadron Officer School, he was assigned to the Air Force Academy in Colorado as a flight instructor. In 1956, he went to West Germany to fly the F-100s with the 36 Fighter Wing. After that, he returned to the USA and gained a postgraduate degree at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, in which he did a doctorate in astronautics. In 1963, Aldrin was accepted by NASA for astronaut training. Michael Collins. Michael Collins went to West Point, Louisiana. After graduating in 1952, he joined the Air Force and was sent to Nellis Air Force Base in Nevada for fighter training. From there, he was stationed in France at a NATO F-56 fighter squadron in 1954. After returning to the U.S. in 1957, Collins was assigned as an instructor. In 1960, Collins enrolled at the Experimental Test Pilot School, Edwards Air Force Base. He was accepted by NASA in 1963 for astronaut training. Armstrong, Collins, and Aldrin had been in the Gemini space program, and two of the backup crew members, Lovell and Anders, also had previous experience in space, most notably as crew members on Apollo 8, the first manned mission to have left low Earth orbit to circumnavigate the Moon. The responsibilities of a backup crew included taking the place of any astronaut who was unable to participate in the mission. The launch. The launch of Apollo 11 took place at 9:32 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, July 16, 1969, from NASA's Kennedy Space Center Launch Complex 39A for an 8-day mission to the Moon and back. After liftoff, the first stage of the Saturn V was jettisoned to about 40 miles in altitude. The second stage was then ignited to boost Apollo 11 to a 100-mile orbital altitude. After reaching the required altitude and the jettison of the first and second stages, the first engine burn or firing of the third stage, SIVB, would insert Apollo 11 into a 100 nautical miles circular lunar parking orbit. After 2.5 hours in Earth's orbit, the SIVB rockets would be fired again, putting Apollo 11 on a translunar insertion, TLI, for a free return trajectory for a 3-day voyage to the Moon. Theoretically, the purpose of a free return trajectory was to ensure that return to Earth in the event of a service module engine failure. A half hour after TLI, the Command Service Module CSM would separate from the SIVB, turn around, and dock with the Lunar Module LM to extract it from the spacecraft LM adapter SLA. After docking procedures, the CSM docked with the LM and would have resumed its course toward the Moon for its planned lunar orbit. At this point, Apollo 11 would be put into the Passive Thermal Control PTC mode. This was a slow roll of the spacecraft on its horizontal axis, thus stabilizing the thermal response to solar heating. This will be discussed in detail in Chapter 5. After reaching the Moon, Apollo 11 would then have been inserted into a 60 by 170 nautical mile elliptic orbit. 2 revolutions later, the orbit would have been adjusted to a near circular orbit of 54 to 66 nautical miles. Both of these lunar orbit insertion burns, LOI, would have been made using the CSM's 20,500-pound thrust engine. Lunar orbit and landing. 21 hours after entering lunar orbit, Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin would have entered the LM to check the systems for a descent to the lunar surface. After separating from the CSM, the LM with Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin on board would then be put into an elliptical orbit on a parasynthion or low point of 50,000 feet above the Moon. From here, the LM, using its 10,000-pound thrust engine, would have begun its descent for its touchdown on the lunar surface, with Michael Collins remaining in the CSM in lunar orbit. After touchdown on the lunar surface on July 20, 1969, the crew would have prepared the LEM for immediate ascent, and then they would have rested for several hours after depressurizing it for their extravehicular activity, EVA. Armstrong was the first to descend the LM ladder to step onto the lunar surface with his now famous quote, "One small step for man, one giant leap for mankind," although there is now some dispute as to what he actually said. However, for the purposes of this chapter, Armstrong's quote is close enough. Armstrong and Aldrin would spend a total of 22 hours on the lunar surface, with approximately 2 of those hours for EVA. Of these 2 hours, they set up a couple of scientific experiments and collected lunar samples that were brought back to Earth, as well as many photos and videos of their EVA on the Moon. After Armstrong and Aldrin completed their EVA, they then prepared to leave the lunar surface. The LM had 2 basic components, the descent stage and the ascent stage. The descent stage encompassed the landing portion of the LM along with a 10,000-pound thrust engine. The ascent stage had its own 3,500-pound thrust engine. On liftoff from the lunar surface, the ascent stage of the LM separated from the descent stage, using it as a launching pad and leaving it behind on the lunar surface. After liftoff from the lunar surface, the LM docked with the CM 3.5 hours later. Once the LM docked with the CM, all lunar samples and videos were stored on board the CM, and the LM ascent stage was jettisoned from the CM. The latter would have then moved onto its trans-Earth insertion, TEI, for its 3-day voyage back. Again, the Apollo 11 spacecraft would have been put into PTC, and 3 mid-course corrections were planned. The mid-course correction aspect of the mission will be analyzed in detail in Chapter 3. Back to Earth and splashdown. Once Apollo 11 had reached Earth, the CM would have separated from the service module and begun its re-entry procedure by positioning the aft part to enter Earth's atmosphere first. This aft portion of the CM contained the main heat shield needed to protect the astronauts and the CM from burning up due to friction with the Earth's atmosphere. Apollo 11 would have entered Earth's atmosphere at 400,000 feet at 36,194 feet per second. The CM splashed down in the Pacific Ocean approximately 1,000 miles southwest of Honolulu at approximately 12:50 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time, July 24, 1969. All of this, of course, is according to the official records, but there are many unanswered questions and contradictions regarding the Apollo man-moon missions, some of which will be discussed in this book starting with the Saturn V. Chapter 2, the Saturn V Rocket. LEO, far as we go. The space program was moved to the forefront of the United States foreign policy when the government was caught off guard by the launch of the first artificial satellite in the world, Sputnik, to low Earth orbit, LEO, by the former Soviet Union on October 4, 1957. This mission was followed by Sputnik 2, launched November 3, 1957, and Sputnik 3, launched May 15, 1958. In fact, when it came to the space program, unmanned or manned, the Soviets were first in almost everything. For example, they were first to have satellites in low Earth orbit, have a man-made object pass near the Moon, launch animals to low Earth orbit, launch the first man to low Earth orbit, launch a dual-man mission to low Earth orbit, launch the first woman to low Earth orbit, launch a multi-person crew of 3 to low Earth orbit, have an astronaut leave a space capsule while in low Earth orbit, land a probe on the Moon's surface and transmit from there, rendezvous and dock an unmanned spacecraft in low Earth orbit, send small animals to the Moon and back, apparently unharmed, and rendezvous and dock between 2 manned spacecraft in low Earth orbit for an exchange of crews. As is apparent, the Soviets were well ahead in the space race with their numerous accomplishments. In fact, for 30 years, from 1957 to 1987, they were first in just about everything when it came to their space program. Everything, that is, except having accomplished the first manned landing on the Moon. Today, as of 2018, theirs is the only country in the world with a working manned spacecraft capable of launching astronauts to low Earth orbit to exchange crews with the International Space Station, the ISS. These Soviet firsts prompted the American government to come up with an ambitious plan for gaining superiority over the Soviet space program. This, of course, led to President John F. Kennedy's speech to Congress in 1961 proposing to send a manned mission to the Moon and return the astronauts safely to Earth before the end of that decade. So, the American government had to achieve this monumental goal in just 8 years with technology that didn't exist at the time. Also, given the political climate during the Cold War, superiority was the goal, which meant that hubris, not a genuine drive for scientific inquiry, drove both the American and Soviet space program policies. The first man to reach space was the Soviet cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin with Vostok 1, which launched on April 12, 1961. Gagarin subsequently became the first man to orbit the Earth in 108 minutes, during which he reached an orbital altitude of 203 miles. The first American to reach space was Alan Shepard with the Mercury mission launched on May 5, 1961. Shepard's mission was a 15-minute suborbital flight reaching a height of 116 miles. Evidently, the American space program had a lot of catching up to do. After Alan Shepard's mission, John Glenn became the first American to orbit the Earth with the second Mercury missions launched February 20, 1962, almost a year after Yuri Gagarin's historic orbital mission. Glenn stayed in low Earth orbit for almost 5 hours. NASA continued with its manned Mercury space program until 1963. It was almost 2 years before the first manned launch of its second space program with the Gemini missions, which ended in 1966. The purpose of these manned missions was to learn and perfect techniques in preparation for the Apollo moon missions. Further, as the technology evolved with these missions, so did spacecraft capacity, where the Mercury missions was a one-man crew, Gemini missions a two-man crew, and Apollo missions a three-man crew. It became obvious in the Mercury and Gemini missions that automation was a necessary component in any manned mission in low Earth orbit or beyond. Astronauts quickly realized that success in these missions has less to do with their flying skills as military pilots and more to do with automation and the increased need for more sophisticated computer systems. As you'll learn in Chapter 3, the computer systems on the Apollo missions were nowhere near the technology that would have been needed for a successful manned mission traveling 240,000 miles to the moon and the same distance back. After the end of the Gemini manned missions, NASA continued with the Apollo program, which launched the first, unmanned Saturn IV on February 26, 1966, manned Saturn IB with Apollo 7 on October 11, 1968, and unmanned Saturn V on November 9, 1967. The next mission in the Apollo program was the launch of the Saturn V on December 21, 1968, which was the first manned mission of a Saturn V and the first manned mission to circumnavigate the Moon. So, in less than 8 years, NASA has managed not only to match the Soviet space program, but surpass Soviet accomplishments in the space race to achieve what had been called the greatest scientific achievement of the 20th century, with the first manned landing on the Moon's surface with Apollo 11 on July 20, 1969. In the next section, I have provided a brief history of the scientists recruited into NASA and one of the most important contributors to the design and manufacture of the Saturn V rocket. The Apollo Saturn V program. The Apollo program was implemented in order to meet President Kennedy's goal of landing a man on the Moon by the end of the 1960s. This required new and innovative technologies to design and manufacture a heavy-lift rocket, which ultimately became known as the Saturn V. This new design was needed to launch the hardware necessary for a manned lunar landing. The Saturn V was reportedly the most powerful heavy-lift rocket ever built, which produced a combined total of over 7.5 million pounds of thrust in its 5 F1 engines located in the first stage of the Saturn V. There has been no working heavy-lift rocket capable of this power output since the end of the Apollo moon missions. It apparently functioned virtually flawless during the Apollo program from 1969 to 1972. In 1973, NASA decided that it would be cost-effective to design a reusable vehicle replacing the Saturn V. In 1973, NASA decided that it would be cost-efficient to design a reusable vehicle replacing the Saturn V, which was supposed to have been proven technology. Subsequently, the Saturn V program was cancelled after launching the first American space station, Skylab, on May 14, 1973. After several years without a manned space vehicle, NASA launched its first reusable manned spacecraft, the Space Shuttle, on April 12, 1981, 20 years to the day since Yuri Gagarin became the first person to orbit the Earth. However, due to the claims of cost inefficiencies and overruns, the Space Shuttle program was also cancelled in 2011. As of today, NASA no longer has a working manned space vehicle capable of launch to LEO. History. The Saturn V rocket program's origins go back to World War II and the German rocket program with its Vengeance Weapon 1 aeroplane V1 and the Vengeance Weapon 2 rocket V2. The V2 was the first ballistic missile ever built and was used to terrorize London in World War II. The architect of the V1 and V2 was Wernher von Braun, reportedly a brilliant aerospace engineer who, as history records, was secretly moved to the United States from Germany at the end of World War II by the American Office of Strategic Services, OSS, under its program, Operation Paperclip. The OSS was a predecessor of the Central Intelligence Agency, CIA. It is estimated that the OSS recruited 1,600 German scientists, engineers, and technicians, while the Soviets recruited an estimated 2,000 German scientists. Wernher von Braun and the other German scientists worked for the U.S. Army on its Intermediate-Range Ballistic Missile (IRBM) program. Later, von Braun and his group were absorbed into the newly formed space agency, NASA. Wernher von Braun and his alleged war crimes. 2 years before World War II, Germany had moved their rocket technology to Peenemünde, a rocket base located on the island of Usedom on the Peene River off the Baltic coast. However, after World War II began, Allied forces launched air raids on Peenemünde, as a result of which this technology, along with the technicians, were moved to other bases around the country, like the underground rocket base at the Middelwerk plant. Serious allegations amounting to war crimes against humanity have been made about personnel of that particular facility, including Wernher von Braun, who was a member of the Nazi Party. During World War II, Germany was using concentration camp prisoners as slave laborers at their Middelwerk plant. An estimated 20,000 slave laborers died from starvation, physical abuse, executions, and brutal working conditions. There has been plenty of debate over the decades about Wernher von Braun's involvement in the estimated 20,000 deaths of war prisoners used as slaves and the deplorable and hellish conditions they had to endure. From Wikipedia. SS General Hans Kammler, who was an engineer, had constructed several concentration camps, including Auschwitz, had a reputation for brutality and had organized the idea of using concentration camp prisoners as slave labor in the rocket program. Arthur Rudolph, chief engineer of the V-2 rocket at Peenemünde, endorsed this idea in April 1943 when a labor shortage developed. More people died building the V-2 rockets than were killed as it by a weapon. Von Braun admitted visiting the plant at Mittelwerk on many occasions and called conditions at the plant repulsive, but claimed never to have witnessed any deaths or beatings, although it had become clear to him by 1944 that deaths had occurred. He denied ever having visited Mittelbrau-Dora concentration camp itself, where 20,000 died from illness, beatings, and intolerable working conditions. There were investigations of some of the scientists recruited by the American government, and it's believed that von Braun himself was questioned about what he knew of the conditions at Mittelbrau-Dora concentration camp. However, all of these scientists' records were expunged by the OSS when they were recruited by the United States, practically ending any paper trail implicating these German scientists, including von Braun. The CIA has maintained that secrecy, although, as the above quote shows, it's now more of an open secret. There were supportedly some witnesses that testified in behalf of von Braun, saying he tried to better working conditions for the slave laborers when possible. However, the veracity of these witnesses and their statements should be considered first before coming to any conclusions. As for Wernher von Braun's Nazi affiliation, proponents of the Apollo mission say that conspiracy theorists use this fact to promote the Apollo mission hoax story. Most serious researchers, who believe these missions to have been fake, separate von Braun's Nazi affiliation and acknowledge his purported brilliance in rocket technology. However, there is a limit to how far that technology will go. Likewise, serious proponents of the Apollo missions also acknowledge von Braun's Nazi affiliation, along with his purported brilliance in rocket technology. The Apollo-Saturn rocket series starts with tragedy. After being recruited into the newly formed space agency NASA, Wernher von Braun was appointed as the director of the Marshall Space Flight Center (MSFC) and as chief architect of the Saturn V rocket. The Apollo program started with the first launch in 1961 involving a variation of the Saturn V rocket, leading up to the first manned mission to land on the lunar surface in 1969. However, when trying to explain each mission and its progress, Apollo mission nomenclature gets a little complicated. For example, the first mission in this series was Saturn Apollo 1 SA-1, not to be confused with Apollo 1, which was a mission simulation of a launch that ended up in tragedy, killing 3 astronauts. There are also the Apollo missions with the prefix AS, not to be confused with SA. To further complicate things, NASA has internal and external designations for each mission. Apparently, the external designations were for the media. In addition, there is a series of 3 books by Eugene Reichel listing each mission in the Apollo program in chronological order, which helps to clarify the Apollo's mission's nomenclature. It is the actual Saturn 1B and most of all the Saturn V which interests us, since these 2 variations involve the first manned missions of the Apollo program to low Earth orbit, to circumnavigate the Moon, and to land on the lunar surface. Leading up to and including Apollo 11, there were 30 missions in the Apollo program. Of these 30 missions, 21 missions involved a variation of the Saturn rocket. Of these 21 missions, 5 were the Saturn 1B and 6 were the Saturn V. However, Apollo 4, the 23rd mission, is where the actual Saturn V missions leading up to Apollo 11 began. Apollo 4 was the first unmanned launch of the Saturn V, but a commonly asked question is, what happened to Apollos 1, 2, and 3? Did they involve the Saturn 1B? No, they didn't even involve a launch, and in fact, this is the part which leads to some of the confusion with these Apollo missions. In order to better answer these questions, let's discuss each mission in chronological order, starting with the Apollo 1 tragedy. Apollo 1. On January 27, 1967 at 1:30 p.m., Commander Virgil Gus Grissom, Senior Pilot Edward White, and Command Module Pilot Roger Chaffee enter the Apollo 1 Command Module on top of the Saturn 1B for a launch simulation. All 3 astronauts were in spacesuits, and when they were strapped into their seats, the escape tower's protective cover was lowered into position on the CM and locked. 3 astronauts were, for all intent and purposes, sealed in. Several hours into the launch simulation, at approximately 6:30 p.m., a fire broke out within the CM. While the astronauts were yelling frantically over the communication frequency and desperately trying to open the command module hatch, technicians outside also tried to do the same, but to no avail. The heat around the CM was far too intense for the technicians to get even close. By the time the technicians opened the hatch, Virgil Gus Grissom, Edward White, and Roger Chaffee had been incinerated. This launch simulation was in preparation for the first manned mission of the Saturn V with Grissom, White, and Chaffee. This simulation mission was then designated posthumously as Apollo 1 in honor of the lost crew. There have been lots of discussions over the decades about this tragedy, as well as some serious accusations leveled at NASA about possible foul play. One theory suggests that Gus Grissom, who more than hinted that the Apollo program was plagued with problems and that it was years away from any attempt at a manned lunar landing, needed to be silenced. However, rather than speculate on this serious allegation, let's instead look at the facts. Gus Grissom was known to be outspoken and was increasingly becoming frustrated with the numerous anomalies within the Apollo program. In a press conference shortly before the tragedy, Grissom hung a lemon on the outside of the command module for the whole world to see, the inference being that the command module was a lemon and not fit for manned space missions. As was common practice with the Mercury and Gemini manned space programs, the command module was filled with overpressurized pure oxygen. Since oxygen makes up about 20% of our nitrogen-oxygen atmosphere, there is enough outside atmospheric pressure at sea level for the lungs to absorb that oxygen into the bloodstream. However, to duplicate sea level pressure in a spacecraft in low Earth orbit would require engineering the hull of the capsule strong enough to withstand sea level pressure against the vacuum of space, as well as carrying the required equipment of nitrogen and oxygen tanks to regulate the mixture. Reinforcement of the CM hull, as well as extra nitrogen and oxygen tanks, would have added weight to the spacecraft, which means more engine power for launch that translates into more propellant and therefore more expense. In order to keep costs down, NASA decided to use pure oxygenated atmosphere and regulate the oxygen environment in the spacecraft to lower levels than at sea level pressure, but with the oxygen pressure content higher, making the transfer of oxygen from the lungs to the bloodstream possible while in orbit. This proved deadly during the simulated launch of Apollo 1 when a spark inside the complex design of the CM caused a fire, turning the oversized pure oxygen environment into a torch, killing the 3 astronauts on board. After the tragic incident, NASA changed the CM environment to 60% oxygen and 40% nitrogen on launch, which decreased slowly on ascent to the eventual pure oxygenated environment over the next day. North American Aviation, NAA, was the primary contractor for the command module. NAA Inspector Thomas Barron had submitted a 500-page report and testified to Congress on April 21, 1967, regarding the anomalies leading up to the Apollo 1 tragedy. 6 days later, Thomas Barron, his wife and stepdaughter were all killed instantly when a train crashed into their car. Since then, Thomas's 500-page report to Congress has disappeared. You can find NASA's internal review report detailing its findings on its website, but there is nothing conclusive to the actual cause of the Apollo 1 tragedy. However, the report does make for some disturbing reading. It seems that no one had seriously considered the hazards of an overpressurized cabin full of pure oxygen. Wikipedia. In the first episode of 2009 documentary series, NASA, Triumph and Tragedy, Jim McDivitt said that NASA had no idea how a 100% oxygenated atmosphere would influence burning. Similar remarks by other astronauts were expressed in the 2007 documentary film In the Shadow of the Moon. These two understated quotes delineate the expertise of NASA's personnel involved in the Apollo program, who were seemingly ignorant to the dangers of an overpressurized oxygenated environment. Note to NASA: it has been established throughout millennia that depriving fires of oxygen is a very effective way of putting fires out. Common sense should then dictate that a pure oxygenated environment is not only a fire hazard, it's a blowtorch waiting for a spark. Spark. Spark.